The second FNaF movie has 3 sets of animatronics: the toys, the Withereds, and the classics. But the Withered and classic animatronics are supposed to be the same animatronics, right? I mean, we've known that since FNaF 2, so why are they separate here? This has caused a lot of discourse online, as a bunch of people, including some of my friends, actually now believe that the Withereds and the classics are 2 completely separate sets of animatronics. However, there's some major problems with that, and in today's video we're going to be addressing it. I was actually originally going to include all of this in my video on Mike Schmidt being Michael Afton, basically just to talk about all the things that the FNaF movie changed people's minds on, but I thought it would be better to stand as its own video, and it ended up being way longer than I expected. So, without further ado, let's get started. We know for a fact that the classic animatronics are possessed by the missing kids. This is clearly illustrated in the week before, most directly through the Happy Birthday Susie part, as well as the FNaF 2 dream sequences. Also, it wouldn't make sense for the FNaF 1 newspapers to talk about the dead bodies being in the animatronics if the animatronics in the game itself weren't those animatronics. So, going by basic logic, it just has to be the case. In FNaF 2's Save Them minigame, we play as Withered Freddy following the puppet, trying to help her save the dead people that we see scattered around the restaurant, seeming to imply that Withered Freddy is in fact possessed. This is also supported by the bloodstain that can be found in Withered Chica's mouth in FNaF VR. Some people suggest that this means that she did the bite of 87, but there's a few reasons that can't be the case. Not only is it very unlikely any of the Withereds did it, including Foxy, due to the fact that they aren't out during the day at all, as well as the fact that the toys are the ones being scrapped at the end of FNaF 2 rather than the Withereds, but also, Withered Chica has a broken jaw, so it's extremely unlikely she could even bite. Plus, if any of the Withereds were to do it, Foxy just makes more sense, considering he's out of order, and in the week before, it said that the animatronic who did the bite was one that was disoriented with lights, and Chica is the only one actively shown to not be. However, that relies on the Withereds and the classics actually being the same. It's kinda hard to say, oh, Withered Chica has to be classic Chica, because she has a bloodstain on her mouth, for a reason other than the bite of 87, because the one who did the bite of 87 wasn't classic Chica. That's kind of a closed loop, where you can't really prove it properly with exclusively that information. Luckily, the week before itself supports the Withereds and the classics being the same. Like I just said, Chica isn't frozen by light in the book, but both Foxy and Bonnie are, and Foxy is also not fooled by Ralph wearing a Freddy mask, directly matching the actions of the Withereds in FNaF 2. But what I think is one of the most important things to discuss here is the stuff that made us realize FNaF 2 is a prequel in the first place. On night 6, Phone Guy says that when Freddy's opens again, he'd take the night shift, as he does in FNaF 1. In the ending newspaper, it says that Freddy's will probably open again with a smaller budget, like how FNaF 1 is a smaller building, and it's the original Freddy's, which we know based on the presence of a safe room after they were discontinued at the first Freddy's, as Phone Guy says in FNaF 3. So yeah, using a building you already own is an easy way to keep the budget low. So these things are clearly referencing how FNaF 1 will happen after this, and they're referring to the future FNaF 1 location. And yet, this same newspaper says that they are keeping the Withered animatronics to use in the next location. These things were very clearly put in here to show that this was before the first game, so mentioning the Withereds being used for FNaF 1 and them not being the classics literally makes no sense whatsoever. If they're not meant to be the same, they'd have been scrapped alongside the toys. So if you think the Withereds are separate from the classics, all I want is an explanation for where they are in FNaF 1, because that line in the newspaper was not put in randomly. It was deliberately added to clarify that this game is a prequel, so it's not unrelated. I can get behind Golden Freddy or the puppet being in the kitchen if they're unused, though that would be kinda weird too, but the Withereds? No, that just wouldn't make sense. Again, they wouldn't say the Withereds are gonna be in FNaF 1 if we never see them in FNaF 1, and the safe rooms aren't being used by this point, so they're probably not in there. But there's more. This is something Phone Guy says on night 2 of FNaF 2.
By now I'm sure you've noticed the older models sitting in the back room. Those are from the previous location, and we just use them for parts now. The idea at first was to repair them. They even started retrofitting them with some of the newer technology, but they were just so ugly, you know, and the smell.
While Phone Guy doesn't outright say it, he's very clearly establishing here that the Withereds were the performers at the first Freddy's, as he says they use them for parts now, meaning they had a different purpose before. Think about it, if not parts, there's not really any other purpose to be had besides performing. He even says they smell bad, clearly spelling out that these were the animatronics that the missing kids were stuffed into, which we've already determined were the classics. The Withereds being the performers at the first Freddy's also lines up with the fact that FNAF 6 shows a Fazbear logo with Unwithered Freddy on it. Withered Golden Freddy is also very clearly the same character as regular Golden Freddy, based on the teleporting into your office and his jump scare being just ahead. So why would that logic not apply to the other Withereds? There's a lot of people who suggest that the Unwithereds don't actually exist, and that the original animatronics were just the classics, which could support the idea of them being different, but it doesn't really make sense. I've been talking this whole time about how the classics and the Withereds both had the missing kids stuffed into them, meaning they're the same, so either the Unwithereds were the originals, or the original animatronics were the classics and Scott just made new models for the sake of them looking different. But the latter kinda doesn't make sense. Not only does he reuse models for the Phantoms in FNAF 3, but he also said all the way back in 2015 on Steam that he tries to model things from scratch in each game, but reuses things when it makes more sense. So if the Withereds were supposed to just be withered versions of the classics, he would have just reused the classics. Many people point to the fact that in the movies, the novel trilogy, and the Into the Pit game, the animatronics from the first Freddy's are designed like the classics. Unfortunately, that's not really the same thing. In those universes, the first Freddy shuts down after the missing children incident and never opens again, so clearly that's an intentional difference. Some also talk about how, in the week before, Ralph says he's happy that they returned the vintage Freddy to his classic look, implying that classic Freddy was the design of Freddy at the first Freddy's. While that is possible, it claims that they restored him, meaning there was a time when this animatronic looked different in some way. So there's a few routes you can take. One is that he was damaged and then repaired, and that's all that Ralph means, which kind of falls under the category of Scott just not reusing the models. 2, you could also say that Classic Freddy was the original Freddy, then he was redesigned to be Unwithered Freddy, then became Withered Freddy, then was repaired and redesigned to be the Classic Freddy again. Technically possible, but it's overly and unnecessarily convoluted. But 3, the most likely option to me, is that he was repaired and redesigned to a look that was more similar to his original design, unlike Toy Freddy, who was used for the previous location and deviated from the original Freddy's design. Others point to Secret of the Mimic, where we can find a prototype version of the FNAF 1 location years before the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza even opens, and there we can find prototypes of the Core 4 animatronics as well, all designed to look like the classics. These animatronic designs were made by Edwin and more specifically Fiona, as we hear about in the audio logs that are down there.
Aren't they insane? The look of these new animatronics is Fiona's design and they're great. Oh, first they approve the art, then they approve the proofs. Now they change their minds. Well, we're so close to final. Why would they change them now? Are they pulling my leg? The new concepts are frankly creepy. No, it doesn't matter. I'm not changing a single bit of her work, and they can't make me.
At one point or another, Henry ordered for the two of them to make animatronics for Fazbear Entertainment, and then apparently ordered for them to make newer designs for them, switching at the last minute to ensure Edwin never completes his projects and therefore they can sabotage him. But which animatronics are we talking about here? Are these animatronics here Fiona's designs? Or are they the new ones Fazbear ordered after the fact? They're the former. Edwin himself says that the animatronics he and Fiona made were not used by Fazbear, and that he refused to make the new ones because they were much creepier. He says that he won't budge, meaning whatever designs were ordered out of him are not the ones in R&D. Those prototypes in the Proto Freddy's are Edwin and Fiona's designs. Later on, we can find a computer in Edwin's house, which mentions alternate Fazbear designs, but we never see them. Given one of the logs from Afton talks about how Edwin breached the contract and they now own his property, it definitely seems like Edwin was telling the truth when he said he wouldn't budge, meaning the classic animatronics, Edwin's animatronics, went unused, leading to Henry making the new designs himself. With this knowledge, we can actually form a pretty decent chunk of Edwin's story. It seems like Henry ordered animatronics out of Edwin, the classics, and he and Fiona started making them. But then, Henry switched the order when they were nearing completion. The animatronics he was told to make instead of the classics were the Unwithereds, which lines up with Edwin claiming they were much creepier than Fiona's designs. After all, even without the withering, the withered animatronics are undeniably creepier than the classics. So the classics go unused, the Unwithereds are made for the first Freddy's, then become the Withereds in FNAF 2, and then FNAF 1 rolls around, and they decide to redesign the Withereds, probably to avoid the bad publicity associated with those older designs after blood and mucus came out of their eyes and mouths, and then they turn them into the classics, finally putting Edwin's designs to use. To me, all that makes sense, and I do think the Withereds are meant to be the classics, but there's one final detail that, for me, is kind of the last nail in the coffin, and it all comes down to something Scott Cawthon himself said more than 10 whole years ago. August 24th, 2015. Scott Cawthon makes a post talking about the FNaF 4 DLC, and an important detail he shared was how the box would not be included in the update. This is what he said, quote, "You know, when I released the first game over a year ago, I was amazed by how quickly everyone found every bit of lore and story. Then the same happened with Part 2. Fans and YouTubers dug in and found everything. Game Theory did an incredible video on Part 2, getting almost everything right." End quote. That right there, that is the most important part of this entire theory. Scott said that Game Theory's FNaF 2 theory got almost everything right. So let's take a minute to break down everything Matt had said in that video. He started off talking about the debate on whether this game is a sequel or a prequel, landing on the conclusion that it's a prequel, most especially due to the paycheck matching 1987, as well as Phone Guy talking about the animatronics moving during the day, which they can't anymore by the time of the first game, not to mention Phone Guy being alive in the first place when he seems to die in FNaF 1. Another reason was the ending newspaper about how Freddy's would open again utilizing a smaller budget and the Withered animatronics. Matt then starts to put together a timeline of events, how FNaF 2 happens before FNaF 1, but how there was a Freddy's location before FNaF 2, and how there was also Fredbear's Family Diner even before that. Then he discusses the Take Cake minigame where we see the death of a child at the hands of Purple Guy, claiming this to be the spirit of the puppet whose tear tracks were imprinted onto the animatronics after they possessed it. He says that this event happens at Fredbear's Family Diner due to the small location where only Freddy appears, and that it's the first event in the timeline up to this point, leading the Fredbear owners to sell off to the company Fazbear Entertainment. Then he goes on to talk about how the missing children incident happened at the first Freddy's, as we know due to Phone Guy claiming the Withered smell bad, as I mentioned earlier, as well as the toys having facial recognition as a safety measure to ensure more kids don't go missing. He says the missing kids and the puppet kid were killed by the same guy, Purple Guy, who was also the guard who worked before Jeremy and was moved to day shift, and that the puppet stuffed the kids into the suits and bonded them to the animatronics. Unfortunately, the toy's facial recognition doesn't stop Purple Guy from killing 5 more children, as supported by both the phone calls and the Save Them minigame. Finally, he talks about Phone Guy being Purple Guy and how the puppet appears as an Easter egg in the West Hall, displaying how these games are about the missing children and the puppet trying to get revenge on their killer. Overall, this was a very good video, especially for the time, but really just think about how much he got right and wrong here. By now we know for a fact that Phone Guy isn't Purple Guy, which was a big chunk of the video, but another big chunk revolves around the puppet kid being killed at Fredbear's, which, while still technically possible, seems to be refuted by the Ticket to Fun book where we see a UV image of Charlotte's death on a page talking about the wristband she wears in the minigame and how they're used at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, implying she died there. So if 2 big parts of the theory ended up being wrong, then if he got even more than that wrong, it would be really hard to truly say that he got almost everything right, especially since there were a few small things that were sprinkled in there that are also slightly wrong as well. To me, it would just not make sense, so it feels very much like MatPat was correct when he talked about the Withereds and the classics being the same, and if he had been wrong about that, what Scott said here would probably not be true. Also, I'll take this time to say that the same kinda goes for the Save Them murders, as there's a lot of people who quite literally just think it didn't happen, yet MatPat said it did here, and Scott's words seems to suggest he was right. This is all speculative, and maybe Scott and I have different definitions of the phrase almost everything right, but that doesn't seem like something Scott would just throw around, so to me, I think Matt got this much right for sure. But that's everything I wanted to talk about for this video. I hope you guys have enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, and let me know your thoughts on the Withereds. Do you think they're separate characters from the classics? Do you think the Unwithereds exist? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys!